needless to say, we're extremely honored tonight to have Ambassador Crumpton here with us tonight to speak to everyone. I think after the 60-minute video, there really isn't any more that I can say, except there's, one interesting thing that I've learned about Ambassador Crumpton that I think comes through a little bit in the books is his passion for education of our children, in letting them understand and know better what it is about how our government operates, both the good things that go on and the dysfunctional things that go on, in his efforts to try and bring clarity to both of those. And it's something that I admire with small children, or not small anymore, 13, 14, 15, that Hank does. I asked him to talk and speak with some of the kids at the local high school, which he was quite excited and smiled right away at that opportunity to do it. And I think it's a great insight into what a wonderful man he is. So with that, Ambassador Crumpton, please.
Tom, thanks for that introduction and for the opportunity to come here. What a great venue, and what a great crowd. Thank you all for carving out some time to come join us today. I'd also like to thank Rolls-Royce for the sponsorship. I'd like to thank some of my friends and business partners who've come today too. You all know who you are, so my gratitude. Also, I'm especially proud to note that my wife Cindy is here. She just flew in today, and one of our sons, Sam, who lives on the other side of the planet, he's here visiting. So Cindy and Sam, thank you very much for coming and joining us and being with us. I dedicated my book to my wife Cindy. We've been together for 30 years, and she's a remarkable, courageous woman. And if you haven't read the book, I hope you will, because there's a particularly important part in there about an operation, and Cindy was key to that operation. She's been to many, so a great partner in marriage and espionage. So thanks for coming. I want to speak fairly briefly and then open it up to some questions and answers. It's a great venue to have a discussion. I'd love to hear from you, hear some of your thoughts, some of your questions. Imagination. I'd like to speak about imagination. I'd like to talk a little bit about intelligence and empathy, those three words. I first wrote to the CIA when I was about 10 or 11 years old. It was a letter requesting employment. I can only imagine it was on some ruled notebook paper and some boy scrawl. What was truly remarkable is a couple of weeks after that, maybe a couple of months, I can't remember, but I came home from school and walked into my bedroom, and there's a letter from the CIA. CIA letterhead with a compass and the head of the eagle. And some kind soul in the CIA many years ago took the time to respond to that letter from a small boy in a small town in Georgia. And they said, "Thank you very much for your interest. Grow up and please reapply." And that's exactly what I did. But it took some imagination for a young lad in a small rural community in Georgia to think that he could apply to the CIA. And I give full credit to my parents. My mother's a school teacher, my father a forester. They're both still doing very well. But they encouraged me to dream and to explore. And I went to the local library and read book after book on history and geography and war and eventually intelligence. I was particularly intrigued by the Revolutionary War and the irregular warfare against the British. Francis Marion, the swamp fox in South Carolina, and the great irregular warfare that he waged, that really captured my imagination, and I thought, well, maybe I could do that at some point. And as I grew older, I read more and more. But an important part of developing this notion, this idea, this dream of serving my nation in the clandestine service, it was more than just books, it was also film, particularly seeing Sean Connery as James Bond in Thunderball. I wasn't that intrigued or that taken with the clothes and the fancy food or the drinks. But as a young lad, I walked out of that movie and I wanted everything else. But most of all, I wanted to serve my country. Came from a family where there was a rich rich history of military service in World War II, going back to the Civil War, even going back earlier. So it was about serving my country, and this also drove the imagination, drove my dream. But it wasn't unbounded, this dreaming. It was formed by study and a determination, and if you will, a deliberate practice to realize what I had imagined. I'll give you one example. As a youngster, I took a geography test. I'm not sure what grade I was in, but it was about the states. It was a blank map of the U.S. with all the 50 states, and I was supposed to write in the names of all the states, and I got them all right except for two. I mixed up New Hampshire and Vermont. I was more than disappointed. I was dismayed, I was disgusted. You know, how could I make such a silly mistake? And so I got a map of the world, and I learned every country on the planet, put it up in my bedroom as a boy, because I knew even then that it would take more than imagination, more than dreaming. It would take a determined and deliberate practice. And I embarked on that to learn some real fundamentals, the geography of the world. And I continued my pursuit of education and learning more about intelligence. And then I did reapply at age 21 and got the same response. I was too young, insufficiently educated, didn't have a foreign language, basically go away, grow up, get some experience and reapply. But being hard-headed and determined, I found a different office in the CIA. And just a few months later, applied to that office, had an interview, was accepted. 9 months later, I joined the CIA at age 23. I was the youngest in my class, the CIA operations class at that time. And I looked around me with all these older, more experienced, more sophisticated people and said, well, I've got a lot of work ahead of me, but I know I can do it. It was about a dream, it was about imagination, but it was also about deliberate practice. Intelligence. What is intelligence? It's more than a dream. It's something that must be very specific. It must be relevant. And one of the most important aspects, characteristics of an intelligence officer, in fact of many leaders, is that they search for what is relevant. But to start, they've got to know that universe of ignorance, that expanding universe of ignorance that we don't know. And within that universe, how do you define that sliver that's really important, that's really relevant? What are the right questions? And that's where you have to start as an intelligence officer. What's meaningful, what's relevant, what will make a difference? You've got to form the right questions, the right requirements. That's one of the first lessons I learned. But not just relevant, intelligence must also be accurate. And people talk about the perfection of intelligence. I've never seen that, and I don't think I ever will. It's the closest you can get to your best concept of what reality might be. So it's got to be relevant, it's got to be accurate, it's got to be timely. If you don't have the information when you need it, you cannot make the right decision, you can't take the right action. And the fourth characteristic, in fact, must be actionable. You should do something with this, otherwise it's not intelligence. It's one of the first lessons I learned when I joined the CIA. What is intelligence? And how do you take that intelligence to inform the President of the United States, the diplomat, the soldier, the policeman, the trade representative, and many more? These customers, these consumers of intelligence, to support them. I learned this throughout my career. Most of it served overseas, undercover, working a variety of different operations. 10 years in Africa, different countries. And those operations, for the most part, particularly in the early years, focused on recruiting foreign nationals to spy for America, to commit espionage for the clandestine service of the CIA. It was about not just collecting intelligence, I learned along the way, the intelligence I described, but it was about understanding these foreign nationals, these prospective partners, these prospective sources that would help the customers, our policymakers, understand the world and take the right kind of action based on the right kind of decisions, which rest on the right kind of intelligence. I learned, starting in Africa, but then later on working counterterrorism, that it was more than data, it was more than a satellite image, it was more than a phone number. It was about empathy. It was about understanding the aspirations, the needs, the hopes of people. And not only the people that you wanted to recruit, the people that you wanted to cooperate with, and there were many foreign services that the CIA cooperates with around the world. It's about understanding their future. One of the best examples I can give you, one of the best lessons I learned, was later in my career when I was meeting with Ahmed Shah Masood. How many of you know this name? Yeah, a handful. Ahmed Shah Masood is a great Afghan warrior. He was from the Panjshir Valley in northern part of Afghanistan, just north of Kabul, and during the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, he repulsed every attempt by the Soviets to hold on to that valley. Today you can go into the Panjshir and it's just littered with Soviet armored vehicles. They never could hold that valley. That was his home. He was a brilliant and brave warrior, very successful. He was also one of our most important partners in Afghanistan. We knew Al-Qaeda, we knew bin Laden was seeking to attack the homeland. And starting in September of 1999, one of my colleagues, a dear friend of mine, Rich, took the first CIA team into Afghanistan to meet with Masood and his people. And so over the previous 2 years, we built this network inside Afghanistan. About 18 months before 9/11, I wanted to meet with Ahmad. So I flew to Central Asia and we met in a safe house. There were just a couple of people there, a translator, and it was a brutal day outside. The wind was blowing, it was cold rain, but we were tucked inside this nice little home, an open fire, the Afghans being very gracious hosts, very generous with what they had, serving hot tea, sweet tea with dried fruit and dried nuts. And we had a great discussion for several hours talking about the enemy, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and what their plans were. And we talked about our joint operations, not just intelligence sharing, but covert action. How could we engage the enemy? How could we provide more resources to Masood and his people, to the Afghans, these few Afghans that were fighting the Taliban? After the end of this long discussion, Masood said, "May I ask of you one more question?" And he's a very tall man, deep lines in his face, weathered. And I looked at him and I thought, of course you can ask me a question. Now, you may recall, some of you, that he was assassinated 2 days before 9/11. Al-Qaeda killed him because they knew how important he was to any prospective alliance between the U.S. and Afghanistan. There are 2 Al-Qaeda operatives posing as journalists used a camera. The explosives embedded in the camera, they detonated it and killed Masood, a great man. This was 18 months before that. And in this discussion, at the very end, I said, "Mr. Masood, of course you can ask me a question. What is it?" He said, "You're a great country. I have such respect for the United States of America. I have such respect for you and for the CIA's clandestine service, and I'm very grateful for your help, and we have much to do ahead of us. But this question is really for your policy leaders, for your citizens. Do they care more about Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, or do they care more about the people of Afghanistan?" And I said, they care more about Al-Qaeda. The answer was obvious. The only person that Masood and his people were talking to in the U.S. government was me, Rich, and our men who had deployed into Afghanistan. And our mission was very singular, it was very focused, it was Al-Qaeda. There was no U.S. government policy for the people of Afghanistan, for this aspiring nation state, for this mix of tribes. There was no intent to help the people of Afghanistan. Masood obviously knew the right answer. I think he was testing me to see if I had enough gumption to tell him the truth. He was also teaching me a lesson, and that's the lesson I'm sharing with you, is that in fact you have to do both. You've got to find and engage the enemy, sometimes with no mercy. And Masood was very good at that. He was a ruthless warrior. But it's much more. It's about understanding the people. It's about an empathetic intelligence that you can only find through shared risk. That was the lesson of Masood, and that's the lesson we took into battle after 9/11. Because we thought not only about the enemy, but we thought about the people of Afghanistan. And I told my men this story, and that's what we implemented. We imagined a victory for the Afghan people, not an invasion by the U.S. We imagined, based on intelligence, and on 9/11 we had more than 100 sources in every province among every tribe in Afghanistan. So we imagined what we could do. We had great intelligence, but we also had an empathetic understanding of that country. When people talk about the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, and that's very commonly known or referred to by journalists, academics, policymakers, and others, I promise you it was no invasion. December 7th, 2001, when Kandahar fell, it was the last urban stronghold of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. A quarter of Al-Qaeda leadership had been killed. 10, 20, 30,000, maybe more of the enemy lay dead across the battlefields of Afghanistan. We had recovered more than 20 sites that Al-Qaeda controlled. This included the anthrax laboratories near Kandahar, and we were exploiting these sites for greater intelligence value, which we would share with allied services around the world, which in turn would lead to more Al-Qaeda operatives captured and killed and more terrorist attacks stopped. December 7th, 2001, less than 90 days after 9/11, the Taliban were routed. They were on the way to Pakistan, those that were alive. How many Americans were on the ground? You hear of the U.S. invasion? There were 410 Americans in Afghanistan. There were 110 CIA officers and about 300 special forces. It was an American victory. It was also an Afghan victory, and we've forgotten that. And in part, that explains why now today we've got 130,000 U.S. and allied troops in Afghanistan. We never learned the lesson, or if we did, we forgot. It was also an Afghan victory. It was about imagining that kind of victory based on great intelligence and an empathetic understanding of the Afghan people. And when we think of war in the future, we need to think of that. We need to realize that the hard power, the military, the covert action, that lethal force, sometimes it's essential because it keeps the enemy from killing us. But that's only the first 10, 20, 30%. That buys us space and time. What about the rest? How do you secure that victory? How do you make it an enduring victory? Well, the people, that's the answer. And how do we support them? How do we help them secure that hard power success? We failed to do that in Afghanistan. I hope we can learn from that. And that, in part, is why I've written this book, to explain what intelligence is, why it's going to be more valuable, and to look to the future and discuss risk and war and what it means for not just Americans and our allies, but for all the people around the planet. And if I can share some of that experience, some of that knowledge over my career with you, and encourage you and your family and your friends, well then I've done my job. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to take some questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you. One of the current criticisms of the drone activity is that it doesn't provide intelligence resource. It kills, but it doesn't allow for any of the information to come back. What's your feeling on that?
The drones, the UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, they do provide intelligence, supporting and collaborating sometimes, complementing human source intelligence, signals intelligence. So I think first and foremost they are an intelligence platform. Your reference though to the lethal strikes, that for the most part has been very successful. I think Al-Qaeda Central, their leadership severely diminished, degraded, particularly in Pakistan and to a lesser extent Afghanistan. I think there is a risk, though, that if we become dependent on this sterile, technical, lethal solution, particularly if it's at the expense of human source networks and at the expense of capturing prisoners instead of killing them, then that's a problem. I think in most of these strikes that I'm familiar with, based on media reporting, they're probably good calls. There may have been some instances where we opted for a drone strike instead of putting some people on the ground. There have been instances, particularly in East Africa, Somalia, I know where they have not used the drones, that they have put teams on the ground for the exploitation of intelligence. It's about the right balance, but there is a risk because it's surprisingly easy to toggle a switch 6,000 miles away and kill somebody. And that distance from the battlefield, that takes you away from that empathetic understanding that I stressed. So robotic warfare, there's some real risk. And the answer to it is leadership. The answer to it is the right policy and understanding that the human condition is the most important aspect of any type of conflict, any type of risk. It's a good question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
When did you tell Cindy what you did for a living, and how did the conversation go?
I probably have a version, and she probably has a different version because it's been so long now, about 30 years. I told her very soon after I met her, long before we were married, long before we were engaged, in fact. I was struck the first minute I saw her, and it was just a matter of weeks, and I told her. I was living in Africa at the time, and I really couldn't justify to myself to ask her to come visit, to continue seeing me if she didn't know the truth. So I told her pretty early. And regarding her reaction, I think it was initial disbelief, and then when we talked some more, she quietly accepted it, and then learned to understand more about the intelligence business. And of course, by the time we were married, I had explained in some detail what I thought this would mean for her. But I couldn't really know for sure. But thanks to her courage and stamina and determination, I couldn't have asked for a better partner in both marriage and espionage. And along the way, raised 3 wonderful young men, all now in their 20s. Thanks for the question.
Do you think coercive interrogation or torture, whatever you want to call it, has been effective for intelligence gathering?
I think that the enhanced interrogation techniques that have been documented, based on what my colleagues have told me, I think that it was effective. General Mike Hayden, a former director of the CIA, he believes it has been effective. I don't have any direct knowledge of that. It can be debated. And there's clearly a bigger question, though. If these techniques are effective. And my personal belief is that all these enhanced interrogation techniques are not torture except for waterboarding. And this is just my own personal intuitive response. I think that waterboarding will cross the line. But even with that, the bigger philosophical, moral question for us is, if those techniques are effective, do we use them? And if we don't use them, what price might we pay? If we do use them, what price will we pay? There's big risk on both sides. And it's importantly something that the CIA cannot answer, should not answer, in fact, should not even advocate. For my view is the CIA should not even be in the business of holding prisoners. I think law enforcement, the military are better equipped to do that. I think CIA should participate in those interrogations for intelligence. But the question is bigger than the CIA, it's bigger than the White House. I think it's a matter for Congress representing the American people to take on. But of course they haven't done that. They, I should note, were fully briefed. The leadership of Congress, the intelligence committees were fully briefed. They not only acknowledged it, but they encouraged it. Now, after this became public, a couple of them did the classic Washington moonwalk and said that they thought that was a horrible thing. Well, they weren't saying that a few years earlier in the wake of 9/11. And that's another reason I wrote the book, was to talk about the responsibility of intelligence consumers, the responsibility of policy leaders. It's pretty convenient for some of our leadership in Washington to say, well, the intelligence made me do it. Or you didn't give me the intelligence, when I needed it. Or it didn't fit my ideological or political agenda, therefore I'm going to disregard that intelligence. If I may expand a little bit beyond your question, one of the points I make in the book was our policy makers, our political leaders, in the wake of 9/11, they said, well, this is a horrible intelligence failure, so let's set up a 9/11 commission to look at the intelligence piece of this. And clearly some mistakes made, particularly at a tactical level. The CIA did not know when and where the attack would come. But the CIA knew an attack was coming, and very specific warning in the summer of 2001. In fact, in August, the CIA wrote a memorandum for the president saying Al-Qaeda intends to attack the U.S. and U.S. interest. And in that memorandum, and it's public record now, specific reference to the 93 attack, the World Trade Center in New York City. The strategic warning, in my view, was there. And more than the intelligence in the years leading up to 9/11, what Al-Qaeda had said and what Al-Qaeda had done. They'd attacked our embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. They had attempted the Millennium attacks across the world that were stopped by the CIA and about 40 other services, foreign services. They had attacked the USS Cole in October of 2000. They were at war against America, but our policymakers, despite our intelligence, didn't seem to understand that, didn't respond, at least the way I thought they should. But in the wake of 9/11, the problem was defined as intelligence failure. And my question today is, well, why wasn't there ever a 9/11 commission to look at the policy failures? But I don't think you'll see one of those being established anytime soon. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, the world is getting smaller and smaller. From the point of view of intelligence agencies, cooperation around the world, in particular when we have situations as we do today in Iran and Pakistan and so forth and so on, are you satisfied with the cooperation you're getting from the other intelligence agencies that have an ability to give assistance to us?
It's uneven, but the trend's in the right direction. If you look at the cooperation among various intelligence agencies, and it's being driven by the growing complexity of transnational threats that pose a real danger to most nation states, whether it's terrorism, whether it's proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, this growing narcotics trade, and we're increasingly interdependent. I believe the chances for major nation-state warfare are greatly diminished. I don't see us going to war with Russia. When I was a boy, that was more than a possibility. We lived under a theory of mutually assured destruction. Those of you old enough to remember the Cold War, it's a pretty horrific political environment in which to live. And when you think about a nuclear strike, well, we don't think about that very much. You look at the interdependence with China, the trade, the debt, their dependence on us as a market. I don't see us going to war with China. And if you look, however, at the growing complexity and concerns of these nation states in a collective sense, I think that trend will continue and you'll have more cooperation. Some of the cooperation with foreign intelligence services is well beyond just exchanging intelligence. It's deep integrated operations. And there are more than a few services that work very closely with each other. I think the CIA, at least during my tenure, increasingly had a leadership role in bringing some of these services together. In fact, one of the things I did when I first got to the Counterterrorism Center in September of '99 was to bring allied services to talk about counterterrorism, not just to hear from the US, but from each other. And we hosted several conferences that in turn led to some pretty complex multilateral operations where you'd have intelligence services from different parts of the world bringing their resources, their people, their intelligence together to attack these common enemies. It's pretty breathtaking, in fact, if you look at how far that cooperation has come. Now, there's still espionage against each other. That's, I think, going to always be the case. But the trend's in the right direction, I believe.
On another occasion, I heard you speak and say that today you said we failed in Afghanistan. On another occasion, you said when you got to Afghanistan, there were no women in school, and now there are 3 million women in school in Afghanistan. The Saudis are allowing women into the Olympics. Is this a real culture change? It's an awe-inspiring number.
Yeah, Richard, thanks for the question. Good to see you. I think that not just the U.S., but the world community has failed in many respects. If you look at Afghanistan, particularly the window of opportunity we have between 2002 and 2005, when it was relatively stable. But the U.S. was in Iraq, resources, attention, focus, took us away from Afghanistan. But it wasn't just the U.S. We thought that the fighting was done, but as I said earlier, that only bought us space and time. And we failed to project that non-military power to help the people of Afghanistan in the way we should have, which is why the Taliban have come back, why Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani network still have safe haven in Pakistan. However, despite these imperfections, despite these failures, I believe, and it really speaks to the determination of the Afghan people, with this window of opportunity, with the Taliban pushed away, they seize the chance that they have. And there have been some good aid programs and some good nonprofit efforts there. I don't want to diminish that in any way. And yes, indeed, 9/11, very few girls went to school in Afghanistan. Today, there are at least 3 million. And if you go to Afghanistan today, you can see them walking down the road 2, 3, 4 miles to get to school. And if you talk about a strategic impact, that's going to be one. Fast forward 10 years from now with empowered women in Afghanistan, that's the last thing the Taliban and Al-Qaeda want. That wasn't necessarily part of the strategic plan out of Washington, but if indeed that trend continues, that's a great thing. And if I may add, I've advocated this with no success, but as an example of the soft power I'm talking about, the projection of non-military power, I can't for the life of me figure out why we haven't, with all the aid and military resources, and bear in mind today we spend about $2 billion a week, $2 billion a week in Afghanistan right now. You could take a week expenditure and supply every village in Afghanistan with renewable energy power, so they would have distributed energy. I mean, there's intense solar radiation. The wind blows like crazy. There's biomass laying around. We've got all this technology. Why don't you give, or better yet, sell to these villages for for a few $100s the ability to produce electricity. Well, what happens in these villages when you do that? Well, you've got lights is the first thing, to help with your security, and so your kids can study at night. You have heat, because it's really cold there at night in some parts of Afghanistan, brutally cold. But then what's the next thing you want to do? What's this human condition, this human need that goes across any culture? You want to communicate. You have electricity, you can communicate. And not just through cell phones, you get a satellite link. And then you bring in the rest of the world. And this is not just attacking the enemy, this is attacking the enemy strategy. And this is a lesson from Sun Tzu in The Art of War. And I try to pay homage to him with the title of my book. Sun Tzu says, you have to know the enemy, you have to know his strategy, and then that's what you attack for an enduring victory. And what is the Taliban strategy, Al-Qaeda? What do they want? They want to keep these villages, these people isolated, ignorant. They want to keep the rest of the world out. But what if you empower them with electricity, with telecommunications? And only half-jokingly, I've advocated for the broadcast of 20 years of Oprah reruns into every village of Afghanistan. You do that, you educate the girls, you win. I'm only half joking. You have empowered women. It's the last thing the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda want. And that would not be that hard. Technically, in terms of expenses compared to what we're spending now, that's how we have to think. We have to think about the people. And there's smarter ways to wage war. Yes, sir. Okay, I'll repeat the question. What's the impact of the elections in Egypt, and what will be the effect in North Africa, the Middle East? The growing participation of people transformed by this technology, and I do mean the people, the society is transformed in a fundamental way. That trend is going to grow. And what we've seen here in the short term is a democratic election, imperfect, but I think it was fairly free, despite the efforts of the Egyptian military. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, their candidate has won with just 50% of the vote. The military has undercut that victory of the Muslim Brotherhood by diminishing, in fact, disbanding parliament, imposing some restrictions. So you've got a balance of power, a tug within Egypt right now between the military. And it's not just the military as we think it here. The military controls an enormous percentage of the economy. And so it's about their existence, if you will, not just military power, but how they live, how they prosper. So you have the military on one side, the Muslim Brotherhood on the other, and then you have a more secular, liberal, democratic minority that really sparked this revolution, if you will. What the outcome in Egypt, I can't predict. My guess is that it will continue to be a struggle, and that this notion of liberalism will slowly, very slowly, spread across Egypt. But bear in mind, the Muslim Brotherhood are not only the most determined, I think, and best organized political force in Egypt, but in some respects they are perhaps also the most ruthless, particularly in concert with the military. It's going to be tough. Your second question, the impact more broadly. Long term, I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, but I'm an optimist by nature. You can't dream of being a CIA spy as a 10-year-old boy in Georgia and become one and not have a degree of optimism and see what we did in Afghanistan and imagine writing a book that is successful. So long term, I'm hopeful, but most of all, not because of my innate optimism, but just because of what I've seen and the power of the people that are empowered at an individual level. And bear in mind, we won the Cold War. It was a great victory. You don't hear anybody out there talking about, well, what about communism as a viable economic, political alternative? And I think that It took 50 years plus, and I think this will take a long time, but I think the trend's in the right direction because of the empowerment of people and the liberal ideas. In countries that are ruled by leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood and others that want to disenfranchise women, that want to block out liberal thoughts, well, they're going to fall behind. And that's one of the biggest concerns in Egypt right now is their economy. They don't have much of a runway left. They've got to get to work. Now, being also realistic, with all this political upheaval in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, it has provided opportunities and opening for Al-Qaeda. And not just in Yemen, but now you see them in northern Mali. You see them an affiliate, Boko Haram, in northern Nigeria. There are some opportunities for Al-Qaeda to come back. And if you want to read the recent remarks of the head of MI5, the British Domestic Service, it was published a couple of days ago. He talks about this in some detail. So I think there's a growing terrorist threat because of this. I also think there's a growing hope for more liberal institutions in the long run. I'm particularly worried about Iran and Syria, but I'll stop there. Okay.
Thank you very much. So much of intelligence has to do with the interpretation of the data that you get. And I was curious whether or not you sense a pressure within the intelligence system to interpret data in such a way that would please policymakers. Mm-hmm. And of course, Iraq is an example that I would like to hear you share your thoughts with us on. But in addition to that, another question would be your prediction about the future of Syria.
Mr. Minister, thank you. I should have acknowledged your presence earlier. The former Foreign Minister of Thailand is here now at UCLA. It's really an honor to have you. And when I talked about some great allied services, Thailand is certainly one other. So thanks for being here. Thanks for the question. Iraq. There's a portion in the book, and I think the story tells or answers your question better than any other way. When I had been asked to come back from overseas to organize and lead the CIA response into Afghanistan after 9/11, I was in the White House Situation Room. It was my first time there. The President was there, Vice President, National Security Advisor Rice was there, Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld was there, his deputy Paul Wolfowitz, and others, probably about 20 around the room. Director of CIA George Tenet was there. He brought me with him so I could explain the CIA strategy. The first CIA team had just landed in Afghanistan, and we were talking about 9/11, talking about our options, what our plans were. And after about 30 minutes of discussion, Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, he interjects with a degree of emotion, and the topic was Iraq. And he started talking about Iraq at some length, about implying there was a link between Iraq, 9/11, and how we need to consider Iraq as a problem, what we should do. And I'm sitting there, and I'm the new guy. I'm the field spook, if you will, sitting here among the National Command Authority. And I think to myself, I said, what is he smoking? I mean, I was absolutely shocked. And I write about this in the book. And he finished this monologue after about 3 or 4 minutes, and then there was an uneasy silence around the table, and no one contradicted him, no one said anything. I didn't say anything. And then we went back to the discussion about 9/11, Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, what we're trying to do. And of course, later on in December of 2001, the president ordered that the plans for Iraq be instituted. And I knew nothing about that, and of course later on it took resources, attention away from Afghanistan. Weapons of mass destruction, the CIA reporting, clearly wrong. George Tenet has written about that in his book. He's acknowledged others have failures in collection, failures in analysis. But based on that one incident, and then other things I've heard, clearly there was a political, ideological predisposition for the U.S. to go to war in Iraq. And the CIA's intelligence, incorrect intelligence, was used in part to justify that. And to the degree that pressure may have been brought, I can't comment, I wasn't there. But when I mentioned earlier about how policymakers have a responsibility, intelligence consumers have a responsibility, the Iraq War is indeed one example. Second question of Syria. There have been some great commentary. Henry Kissinger wrote an op-ed saying we should stay out because we need to recognize the nation state, the balance of power, and we should not become entangled. Others, like Anne Marie Slaughter at Princeton, has written that there's a compelling humanitarian need. I think that there should be more aggressive support to the people of Syria. Yes, there's a humanitarian mission. Yes, I understand that the nation state will remain the most important organizing principle of international affairs, but I think the world is changing. And if the U.S. and our allies are not inside Syria competing, helping the people of Syria for the future of Syria, then I don't think we're doing our job. I'm not talking about invasion, I'm not talking about U.S. combat troops on the ground. There are a lot of things that I think we could be doing to help the Syrian people. Now, it's a matter about intelligence, about understanding and mapping that very complex human terrain inside Syria, the many factions. But I don't think we can ignore it. And geopolitically, if we take Syria out of, or more accurately, if we empower the Syrian people to take back their country and therefore take Syria out of the Iranian orbit, well, that helps not just our friends in Israel and our friends in Lebanon, but it helps the entire Middle East. Because I see the current regime in Iran as an implacable enemy. Thank you for the question. Over here, please.
Thank you. You alluded to Iran briefly, and I wondered what your thinking was about their ability to mount a nuclear weapon, and also what you think, if anything, America should do about it.
I think the Iranian regime is determined to acquire a nuclear weapon. I think that for the first time, however, our diplomatic efforts, this embargo, the sanctions, which kick in full force 1 July with the participation of the Europeans, is really hurting Iran. It's going to hurt them a lot more. I believe that we should do everything we can to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And I think a lot of things have been done. Some of this has been in the press. But I think they should be short of an overt military strike by Israel or the U.S. And the reason I view it this way is if you look at Iran and you look at the surrounding area and ask yourself, well, who are the most important allies we have when we think about Iran? People say Israel, the Saudis, they've got obvious issues related to Iran. But the most important allies, the Iranian people. The 2009 Green Revolution, it was repressed, but it was not extinguished. Half of the population of Iran was born after the 1979 revolution, and they hate the regime for the most part. It is a corrupt and cynical regime. The Iranian people know that. And I fear that, well, first, if an overt military strike is launched, there's no guarantee that it would succeed. I mean, the Iranians have been very smart. They've dispersed, they've buried all their facilities. So I think a campaign like that would require a sustained bombing for many weeks. And every time you drop a bomb on Iran, what would it do? It would push the Iranian people closer to the regime, I think. Well, our strategy should be just the opposite. How do you help empower the Iranian people and pull them apart from the regime? The Iranians have been very adroit. They've maneuvered between our concepts of conventional diplomacy and conventional war. Well, there's a whole range of options in the middle. And you think of how the Iranians have exercised these options. Starting in '79, when they held our diplomats hostage for 444 days, there have been more held, except our Canadian friends were able to exfiltrate some diplomats in a very remarkable operation. But since '79, the U.S. Embassy in Beirut was attacked. Marine Corps barracks in Lebanon, Khobar Towers, attacked in Saudi Arabia. That was a Hezbollah operation, funded, directed by the Iranians. They've killed our troops in Iraq, in Afghanistan. More recently, in fact, just a few weeks ago, there was a news report of the Iranians seeking to attack and kill U.S. diplomats next door in Azerbaijan. They've gotten away with this for 3 decades. And our response, I think, has been weak and perhaps even feckless. And so the Iranians continue. And it's not only acquisition of a nuclear weapon, it is this policy of state-sponsored terrorism. I see the Iranian regime as an implacable enemy, and we should have been doing a lot more earlier to take them head on, but not at the expense of the Iranian people. You're welcome. Harley, good to see you.
Likewise, Hank. Thanks for your comments. Since we're friends, 2 semi-personal questions.
Mhm.
First, what do you miss most about serving in the agency? And 2, what has surprised you most about working in the private sector?
Yeah, great questions. The first is my friends and colleagues, and not only fellow CIA officers, but a lot of my friends and colleagues around the world in foreign intelligence services. Got some great relationships, and it's difficult, in some cases impossible, to maintain those relationships and those friendships. But for all the bureaucracy and all the challenges and disappointments and indeed heartbreak, I've got some terrific memories, and those memories are about the men and women of the CIA. What surprised me most about the private sector? How much I enjoy it. I really wasn't sure. I left government service at age 50, retired, and it was driven by simple economics. We have 3 children. The oldest was in a very prestigious, very expensive school. The other 2 were in the pipeline to go to college, and it was about paying for their tuition. And aging parents, so it was about family, and it was the right choice. But I wasn't sure what that meant. Would I go work for a big company? And I spent a year in the private sector on my own, exploring, basically doing a reconnaissance by fire, if you will, to see if I could survive, to see if I've enjoyed it. Could I contribute in some way, some meaningful way? And thank goodness I had some terrific coaches and mentors along the way that helped me, that encouraged me, that gave me opportunities. But what I did miss was not having a team. It would have been a lot simpler if I just continued on my own, and I could, probably paid for the kids' school. But I really missed having a team and trying to accomplish my mission that exceeded just paying for the kids' tuition. And so I started a small consulting firm almost 5 years ago. Brought in some CIA colleagues. Some of them are referred to in the book. And we have a great company. And it's a great mission because we are trying to, in the private sector, address some of those issues I talked about. How do you bring energy and infrastructure and healthcare and education to parts of the world that can really use it and profit at the same time? I talk about the projection of non-military power. Well, how can we project market forces and capital and expertise into emerging markets in a positive, constructive, respectful way to help our clients and to advance the development of emerging and frontier markets? That's our mission. So it's a lot more fun, it's a lot more enjoyable, and then, frankly, it's a lot more rewarding than I would have thought when I was in the government. Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Charlie. It's really good to see you. Is there a question here? Or, oh, I'm sorry, in the back. You got the microphone. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Ambassador. I was wondering what the writing process was like for your books, such as the working relationship with the CIA Publications Review Board.
Well, that was easy. Let me tell you about the hard part first. Once my agent, Andrew Wiley, convinced me to write a book, and other colleagues talked to me about the importance of sharing my experiences, and I reflected on this and decided to write. it was really hard, particularly the first 6 months. And I started trying to seek some guidance and reading about other authors and what it was like for them. And one of the best descriptions that I came across was, now I forget which author said this, but he said it was like digging a ditch. It was the mental equivalent of just digging a ditch. And for me, that's the best description. I used to dig ditches when I was a teenager, so I knew what he was talking about. And the problem in writing was I wasn't sure if I was going in the right direction. I didn't know if I was digging too deep or too shallow. I mean, there was a lot going on there. But it was, I talked earlier about determined, deliberate practice and effort. That's what it was for 2+ years. And you'd write something and you'd go back and reread it and say, that's the worst thing I've ever read in my life. And you'd be disgusted and have to go back and rewrite it several times. The Publications Review Board, however, was really very professional. They had a policy of a 30-day response, so I'd give them a draft, and sure enough, within 30 days, they got it back to me. And by the time it was done, 100,000 words, they had redacted less than 5%, and then we had some discussions, and then I'd say more than half of that was restored. And in the end, there were only just a couple of points that I really disagreed with them on, and so that was, in my view, not a problem. Now, I wrote the book with an acute sense of responsibility. I didn't want to expose secrets, particularly sources and methods. So that was not a problem. Thanks for the question. This gentleman here, and then maybe this lady over here.
When can we expect you to enter politics?
I have no plans to enter politics. Thank you for the question. That's an easy answer. This lady over here, please.
You've spoken a lot about kind of education in terms of intelligence and making the populace more aware of kind of the value. But what would you define as the balance between this necessary secrecy and yet the education of intelligence?
Yeah, very good question. And in part, well, that's why I wrote the book. One thing that I've advocated, and this question in part was asked in a recent interview by Harper's Magazine, and one thing I advocate is that the bar for classifying secrets be raised. I think there's far too much classification. There's far too much that's labeled confidential or secret that doesn't need to be. Now, that would, I think, encourage two things. It would enable the citizens to learn more about what's really going on because there's less classified information, and it would make government more effective because the cost of classification is enormous. In fact, there's a private sector industry that makes a lot of money off of this. Washington Post has written a pretty frightening essay about the cost of secrecy. But one of the opportunity costs is that American citizens can't read some of this stuff that I think they should, that I frankly don't think is secret. But it's certainly not my place to go and expose those secrets. The second thing I believe is the education, and there's a lot of open source even now that is available, and I'm encouraged because by 9/11, or during that time, there are only a handful of universities that taught courses on intelligence, and today there are about 100, including places like the University of Kentucky. So state universities, some of the Ivy League schools, others, you can study intelligence, and you think that would be the case with a budget being $75 billion a year, you would hope somebody's studying it as a discipline. And so I think that will continue. And the other point I think is important is that we need to think about the spies and the soldiers that are waging war today. It's only a small fraction of the American population, well under 1%. Well, we need to know more about their roles and responsibilities in this evolving type of conflict. And frankly, the spies and warriors need to know more about America, in this great, dynamic society. There's a long way from the deserts of Helmand Province and Main Street of Wall Street. And so it works both ways. I took an academic sabbatical after my year of service in working in Afghanistan after 9/11. By that time, I had spent 4 years in counterterrorism from '98 until the summer of 2002. It was a great sabbatical because the CIA, they were very generous, and they paid my salary and funded the tuition. And I went to Johns Hopkins, the School of Advanced International Studies, and it was a wonderful time to not only reflect on my clandestine service and put it in some broader academic context, but to look at the rest of the country and to meet people that weren't spies or warriors or terrorists. I mean, it was a great interlude, and it's important that both sides know each other, because it's going to be more important. The gap between the soldier and spies and society, we need to close that, and that's in part why I wrote the book also. Yeah. Maybe one more question. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a high school educator, and I'm here with some of my colleagues, and I just wonder your thoughts on how we better teach empathy to our kids.
I think there's no substitute for experience, for shared risk, if you will. Let me relate to you a conversation I had with one of the leaders in the CIA at the time. In fact, Rich and I were having this conversation. Kofor Black, the head of the Counterterrorism Center, was with us, and we were meeting with the head of the clandestine service. And I outlined this meeting in the book. And there was reluctance for us to deploy teams in Afghanistan because of the risk, the real risk to Rich and his men. And the head of the service said, well, look, let's just have a telecommunications link. We can handle this remotely. It'll be much more secure. And I made the point that if we're not there with them, if we're not breaking bread with them, if we're not showing them that we really care, it's not the same thing. And I learned that on my first tour. So when you think of students or others, and it's really easy to communicate long range now, but there's no substitute. And let me finish, if I may, with a little vignette. You've been very patient. Thanks for some great questions. But I think it expands on your question. This has nothing to do with the intelligence business. It's one of the most important lessons I learned. I was in Africa, and as I do every couple of months, I go up by myself and spend a couple of days out hiking. And I had taken my little Jeep and parked it right near the lip of this old volcanic crater. It was in the Rift Valley. It was a beautiful day, and so I set up my little tent. That was early in the morning. I took off on a long hike, for most of the day, and came back. And when I was tired, I was sweaty, and been gone all day, and came back to my nice little tent and my Jeep. It was in the middle of nowhere, so nobody had bothered it. And I come down, take a swig of water, and take off my boots, and I sit down, and I look up, and there's this little Maasai boy. He's about 8, 9 years old. And I don't know where he came from. He was just sort of there, and he was just looking at me. And so I gave him some water and gave him a Cadbury's chocolate bar, and he nibbled on that, and he was looking around exploring. And he looked in my tent, he looked in the Jeep, he looked at me, and I thought, well, this kid's got to be impressed. He's never seen anything like this. So I was feeling just maybe a little bit smug. And the boy walks over, and he's barefoot, of course. He's got a little tattered leather strip around his groin, and he's got a little stick, and he's filthy. I mean, he's dirty. He's got open sores. He's got flies flying all over him. He's got cow dung on him. And he's looking around. He looks at my boots, and he walks over, and he picks up one of my boots, and he looks at it. And he smells it. And just this expression of complete disgust. And he throws the boot down. And he looks at me, and he just turns around and walks off. And so my smugness evaporated pretty quickly. And I thought, well, what else did this kid think, besides me being this filthy white guy? And I thought, well, maybe he wondered what I am doing out here with all this stuff. I've got a tent, I've got a Jeep, I've got all this paraphernalia. This kid's out here, and you're naked with a switch, a little stick. And I thought, well, he probably thinks I'm pretty weak. What else might he think? Well, I'm not here alone. He's going back to his manyata, to his little thatched hut in his village, and he'll sleep with his extended family and have the cows all around. So he probably thinks I'm socially crippled I'm out here alone with no wife, no family. And then I think, well, what about wealth? Well, if you're a Messiah, you measure wealth one way only, and that's the number of cows you have. I obviously had no cows with me. So I'm poor, I'm weak, I'm socially inept, and I'm unclean. That's probably all going through his mind. So I sat there as the sun went down and the air cooled and reflected on that lesson. And I promise you, the next time I met someone else, I thought about, well, just maybe open your mind a little bit more and try to put yourself in their position. And that night, I might add, I left my boots outside of that tent. So let me also pass on the lesson of that small Messiah boy. When we think about empathy, we think about different perspectives. Let me conclude, if I may, by Tom thanking you again for such a terrific venue, and what a great crowd. You were a dear friend. I've known Tom since I think 2005. We met at the Aspen Institute. It's just wonderful for you to host this reception, and it's great to see some old friends. I'm almost embarrassed. I've seen some people here that I hadn't seen in a while. I have to come to this venue to say hello, but I'll try to come back a little more often. But I wish you all the very best and have a good evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much, and once again, a round of applause for Hank and his team, the guys who are here with him this evening, for all our CIA men and women around the world, and for the job they do for us every day. I'd like to conclude. Hank mentioned Anne Marie Slaughter. Anne Marie is was the Undersecretary for Plans and Policy at the State Department, ran the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, and I think we're going to have her here as our next speaker. So if anyone has any comments on that, I saw Anne Marie last week in Washington. David Sanger from the New York Times has volunteered also. David's the correspondent, the White House correspondent, who has a new book and is interested in coming out and joining us. So any thoughts that any of you have about this, we intend to continue on with the series and look forward to seeing you and the suggestions that you all may have. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. There is a copy of Hank's book that's available for everyone over there. It's free. Just go by and pick it up. He's signed them. And we'd like you all to have that. And it's a book well worth reading. There's a lot of books out there. Hank's done a marvelous job. Thank you all very much for coming this evening.